The morning air had a bite to it as Lisa pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. Fall in Atlanta meant unpredictable weather, one day warm enough for short sleeves, the next requiring a scarf and gloves. This particular Tuesday in October felt more like December, and Lisa wished she'd worn an extra layer for her walk to work. She followed her usual route, passing the same storefronts and nodding to the same early morning dog walkers. 20 minutes from her apartment to the event planning office where she worked, she could practically do it with her eyes closed after 3 years. But today, something was different. On the corner of Pine and 4th Street sat a man she hadn't seen before. He wasn't doing anything particularly noteworthy, just sitting quietly on a weathered backpack, watching people pass. Unlike some of the other homeless folks in the area, he didn't have a sign asking for help. He didn't shake a cup of coins or call out to passers-by. He just sat, shoulders hunched against the cold, his dark hands wrapped around his knees. Lisa slowed her pace slightly as she approached. The man was older, maybe in his 60s, with a salt and pepper beard and tired eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the people walking by. He wore an old military-style jacket that had seen better days, patched in several places and missing buttons. She hesitated for just a moment before continuing on her way. Something about him lingered in her mind all morning as she answered emails and coordinated details for an upcoming corporate event. During her lunch break, she found herself walking to the cafe across the street, ordering not just her usual sandwich but an extra coffee and bagel. "You sure you want it with everything?" the cashier asked, eyebrow raised at her double order. "Yes, everything," Lisa confirmed, though she wasn't sure if the man on the corner would want onions and capers on his bagel. Better to have options than nothing at all, she figured. 5 minutes later, she approached the corner again. The man was still there, though he'd shifted to face the sun that had finally broken through the morning clouds. "Excuse me," Lisa said, her voice coming out softer than intended. "Would you like some lunch?" The man looked up, surprised, as if he'd been invisible all morning and couldn't believe someone had finally seen him. He didn't respond immediately, just studied her face with an intensity that made Lisa wonder if she'd made a mistake. "I got an extra bagel and coffee," she added, holding out the paper bag. "I thought you might be hungry." After what felt like a full minute but was probably only seconds, he reached out and accepted the bag with a nod. "Thank you, miss," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "That's mighty kind." Lisa smiled awkwardly, unsure what to do next. "It's no trouble. Have a good day." She turned and walked back to her office, feeling a mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. Satisfaction, relief, a twinge of guilt that she hadn't done more. She pushed these thoughts aside as she returned to work, but the man's weathered face stayed with her. The next morning was warmer, almost pleasant. Lisa found herself stopping at the cafe before her morning commute began, picking up 2 coffees and 2 breakfast sandwiches. She wasn't sure if the man would be there again, but something told her he would. She was right. He sat in the same spot, this time with an old book open on his lap. As she approached, he looked up, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Good morning," Lisa said, more confident than yesterday. "Brought breakfast if you'd like some." This time he accepted with less hesitation. "Thank you kindly. Not many folks bother to stop twice." "I'm Lisa," she offered, surprising herself. She hadn't planned to introduce herself. He nodded slowly. "People call me Washington. Like the state or the president. Take your pick." Lisa smiled at that. "Nice to meet you, Washington. The coffee might still be too hot. Careful." Washington took a sip anyway, closing his eyes briefly as the warmth spread through him. "Perfect," he said. "Just perfect." Lisa checked her watch. "I've got to get to work, but maybe I'll see you tomorrow." "I'll be here," Washington replied simply. "Don't have many other appointments." That exchange marked the beginning of a routine neither of them could have anticipated. Each morning, Lisa brought breakfast. At first, their interactions were brief, a quick hello, a thank you, and she'd be on her way. But gradually, a minute turned into 5, and 5 sometimes stretched to 15. She learned that Washington had indeed been in the military, Army to be specific. He'd served for nearly 20 years, including time overseas during Desert Storm. He didn't talk much about his service at first, just mentioned it in passing when Lisa asked about his jacket. Was it hard? She asked one morning, instantly regretting the vague, potentially insensitive question. Washington looked at her for a long moment. Which part? The fighting, the coming home, or the ending up here? He gestured to his corner. Any of it. All of it, Lisa replied honestly. The fighting was what I was trained for, he said. Coming home was harder. Nobody trains you for that. He took a bite of his bagel, chewing thoughtfully. As for this, he looked around at his meager possessions. This happened so slowly I hardly noticed until I was already here. Lisa nodded, not knowing what to say. She was 28 years old with a steady job and a tiny but comfortable apartment. What did she know about his struggles? I don't need pity, Washington said, seeming to read her thoughts. Just conversation sometimes, and these bagels. The corner of his mouth turned up slightly, the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him. As weeks turned to months, Lisa learned more about Washington's life in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle gradually coming together. He'd grown up in Georgia, joined the Army at 18, married young and divorced younger. He had a daughter somewhere in the Midwest whom he hadn't spoken to in years. She's better off, he said when Lisa asked if he wanted to reconnect. Some broken things. Stay broken. Lisa didn't agree but didn't push. Instead, she told him about her own life, her job planning corporate events and fundraisers, her roommate who played music too loud, her parents who worried she wasn't settling down fast enough. They think at 28 I should have a husband. And a baby on the way, she told Washington one chilly morning in December. They don't understand that things are different now. Parents rarely understand the times their children live in, Washington replied. My own father couldn't fathom why I'd want to join the Army instead of working at the factory like he did. By January, Lisa had convinced Washington to visit the local VA office. He was reluctant at first. They can't help, he insisted. Tried before. Things change, Lisa countered. New programs, new people. Let me go with you, at least to ask. To her surprise, he agreed. On her day off, they spent 3 hours navigating the bureaucracy of veteran services. Washington's patience wore thin quickly, but Lisa persisted, asking questions, taking notes, gathering pamphlets. That was a waste of time, Washington grumbled as they left. Maybe, Lisa admitted, but now we know what's available, and they have your information in the system. What neither of them expected was the phone call Lisa received a week later. The VA had found Washington's records, including his service history and the benefits he'd never claimed. There was a possibility of housing assistance, medical care, even back payments he was entitled to. When Lisa shared this news, Washington's reaction wasn't what she expected. Instead of relief or happiness, his face darkened. I don't want to get my hopes up, he said flatly. Been disappointed too many times. I understand, Lisa said, though she didn't really. But what if it works this time? Washington sighed heavily. Then I'll have you to thank, won't I? As winter deepened, their morning meetings continued. Lisa learned to bring hot tea instead of coffee on the coldest days, and always made sure Washington had hand warmers and extra socks. He initially refused these additional offerings. The food is enough, he insisted. It's freezing out here, Lisa countered. Please take them. Eventually, he accepted, though Lisa noticed he often gave the extra supplies to other homeless people in the area. An older woman who sat by the library, a young man who paced anxiously near the bus stop. You're not the only one who can be generous, Washington told her with that almost smile when she asked about it. By spring, something had shifted. Washington had begun meeting with a caseworker at the VA regularly. He'd received a cell phone through a veterans program, and Lisa had programmed her number into it for emergencies. The first time he called her wasn't an emergency at all. It was to tell her that he'd been approved for temporary housing, a small room in a transitional facility for veterans. That's wonderful, Lisa exclaimed, genuinely thrilled. When do you move in? Tomorrow, Washington said, his voice betraying a mix of emotions. Guess you can save money on bagels now. Don't be ridiculous, Lisa replied. I still want to hear how you're doing. Maybe we can meet for lunch sometimes instead of rushed morning coffees. There was a pause on the line. Why? Washington asked finally. You've done your good deed. Got the homeless vet off the street, mission accomplished. Lisa was stunned into silence for a moment. Is that what you think this is, some kind of project? Isn't it? His voice was flat. No, Lisa said firmly. It's a friendship. At least that's what it is to me. Another long pause. Yeah, Washington said finally, his voice softer. To me too. The corner of Pine and 4th Street felt empty the next morning. Lisa still brought 2 coffees out of habit, ending up giving the extra to a surprised businessman waiting for the bus. She smiled thinking about Washington in his new room, with a real bed and a door that locked. It was just the beginning of a long road, she knew, but it was a start. Her phone rang that evening as she was making dinner. The bed has springs that poke my back, Washington said without preamble. But it's still the best sleep I've had in 3 years. Lisa smiled, stirring her pasta sauce. I'm glad to hear it. Tell me more about this place. The Veterans Housing Facility wasn't much to look at, a converted motel with peeling paint and narrow walkways. But to Washington, it was a palace compared to the street corner. His room had just enough space for a twin bed, a small dresser, and a chair by the window. The shared bathroom down the hall sometimes ran out of hot water, and the communal kitchen was often messy, but none of that mattered. He had a roof, walls, and a door with a lock. Lisa visited him there for the first time 2 weeks after he moved in. She brought a small potted plant. To liven the place up, she said, and a deck of cards. Thought we could play gin rummy, she explained, sitting cross-legged on the floor while Washington took the chair. My grandfather taught me when I was a kid. Washington hadn't played cards in years, but his hands remembered what his mind had forgotten. Soon they fell into an easy rhythm, the slap of cards on the floor punctuated by occasional trash talk. You're hustling me, Lisa accused when Washington won 3 games in a row. He chuckled, a rare sound that transformed his face. Militaries, good for 2 things. Following orders and playing cards. Not much else to do during downtime. As spring warmed into summer, their friendship deepened. Lisa learned that Washington had once been a skilled mechanic, both in the Army and after. He spoke about engines with the same reverence some people reserved for fine art. Nothing more satisfying than diagnosing an engine problem just by listening, he told her one evening as they shared takeout Chinese food in the facility's small courtyard. Like a doctor with a stethoscope. Could you work as a mechanic again? Lisa asked, twirling lo mein around her plastic fork. Washington looked down at his hands, which sometimes trembled now. Don't know. Been a long time. World's moved on to computers and such. But the basics are the same, right? Cars still have engines? He nodded slowly. Suppose they do. Lisa mentioned this conversation to her boyfriend David later that night. They'd been dating for almost a year, and while he'd been supportive of her friendship with Washington, he'd never fully understood it. You really think some garage is going to hire a 60-something homeless guy with no recent experience? David asked, his tone gentle but skeptical. Former homeless guy, Lisa corrected. And yes, if they're smart, he knows more about engines than half the so-called mechanics charging $80 an hour. David raised his hands in surrender. Okay, I just don't want you to get his hopes up. Too late, Lisa replied. I already got my own hopes up. The next day she arrived at Washington's place with a stack of printouts, job listings, a mechanics refresher course at the community college, and information about a program that helped veterans re-enter the workforce. Washington flipped through the papers with a frown. This is too much, Lisa. I'm not ready for all this. You don't have to be ready for all of it, she countered. Just one small step. Maybe start with the VA career counselor. They could help figure out what's realistic. Washington sighed heavily. Why are you pushing so hard? The question caught Lisa off guard. Why was she so invested in his future? She, Barely knew him 6 months ago. Because, she started, then paused to find the right words. Because I think you deserve a chance to be more than just a survival story. And maybe selfishly, I want to know I helped make that happen. Washington studied her face for a long moment. At least you're honest about it, he finally said. Most people pretend their good deeds are completely selfless. Lisa laughed despite herself. Well, you've never let me get away with pretending anything. That brutal honesty was what she valued most about their unlikely friendship. Washington never sugarcoated things or offered empty platitudes. When Lisa complained about work drama or relationship tensions, he listened without judgment, but didn't hesitate to point out when she was being unreasonable. Your boss isn't a monster for asking you to redo the proposal, he told her during one of her venting sessions. Sounds like you rushed it and made mistakes. Whose side are you on? Lisa had demanded, half joking. The side of reality, Washington replied simply. By late summer, Washington had indeed met with the VA career counselor. The meeting led to an assessment of his skills and the discovery that while automotive technology had advanced, his mechanical knowledge provided a solid foundation. The counselor connected him with a training program specifically for veterans, focusing on updating skills rather than starting from scratch. Lisa celebrated this small victory by taking Washington to dinner at an actual restaurant. Nothing fancy, just a local diner. But it was the first time they'd shared a meal somewhere other than his room or a park bench. This feels strange, Washington admitted, looking uncomfortable in the vinyl booth. People are staring. Lisa glanced around. No one's staring. And if they were, so what? We're just two friends having dinner. Washington fidgeted with his napkin. A young white woman and an old black man don't read as just friends to most folks. Lisa hadn't considered this perspective. Does that bother you? What people might think? Bothered me my whole life, what people think, Washington replied. Can't say I've gotten over it even now. The honesty of his answer made Lisa reflect on her own privilege. She'd never had to worry about being judged simply for sharing a meal with someone. I'm sorry, she said quietly. We can get the food to go if you'd be more comfortable. Washington shook his head. No. Time I got comfortable being uncomfortable again. Part of rejoining the world. That phrase, rejoining the world, stuck with Lisa. It captured exactly what Washington was doing, step by difficult step. She realized how much courage it took, how much easier it might have been to stay isolated, to reject help, to give up. Fall brought new challenges. Washington started his training program, which meant navigating public transportation, interacting with classmates decades younger, and struggling with technology that hadn't existed when he last worked as a mechanic. Feels like I'm trying to catch a train that left the station 20 years ago, he confessed to Lisa one evening, exhaustion evident in his voice. These kids talk about cars like they're spaceships. But you're still going, Lisa pointed out. That counts for something. Counts for sore feet and a headache most days, Washington grumbled, but there was a hint of pride beneath his complaints. Lisa's own life grew more complicated that autumn. Her parents visited from Ohio, insisting on meeting David and dropping heavy hints about marriage. Her boss assigned her bigger events with more responsibility, which meant longer hours and more stress. And David, after a year of dating, was pushing for them to move in together. I love my apartment, Lisa protested during one discussion about cohabitation, and I'm not sure we're ready. We've been together over a year, David pointed out. Most couples our age are already living together or getting engaged. Since when do we care what most couples are doing? Lisa asked, irritated by the comparison. The truth was she wasn't sure why she was hesitating. David was kind, steady, and supportive. They rarely argued, shared similar values, and genuinely enjoyed each other's company. On paper, moving forward made perfect sense. She found herself discussing this with Washington during one of their weekly card games. You don't need my advice on this, he said, arranging his cards carefully. I'm not asking for advice, Lisa replied, just thinking out loud. Washington gave her a knowing look. Sure you are, you want the old man's wisdom. He laid down a sequence of cards. Gin, by the way. Lisa groaned at both his victory and his insight. Fine. What do you think? I think, Washington said slowly, that when you're ready to share your life with someone, you don't need to make pros and cons lists. You just know. That's not very helpful, Lisa complained. Wasn't trying to be helpful, just honest. He gathered the cards and shuffled them with practiced hands. When I married my wife, ex-wife now, I never once wondered if it was the right move. That came later. His eyes took on a faraway look. Maybe I should have wondered more at the beginning. As Thanksgiving approached, Lisa faced a dilemma. She'd planned to visit her parents in Ohio, but the thought of Washington spending the holiday alone in the veterans facility bothered her. "Come with me," she suggested impulsively during their card game the week before. Washington stared at her like she'd grown a second head. "To Ohio? To your parents' house for Thanksgiving?" "Yes," Lisa said, warming to the idea. "David's going to his sister's this year anyway. Mom always makes too much food, and they've been asking about this veteran friend I mention all the time." "Lisa," Washington said firmly, "that's not a good idea." "Why not?" "Because I'm not a charity case you bring home for the holidays," he said, his voice sharp. "And I'm not some feel-good story to show your family what a good person you are." His words stung. "That's not fair," Lisa protested. "I invited you because you're my friend and I care about you." Washington sighed, his anger deflating. "I know you do, but there are boundaries, Lisa. Lines that keep our friendship healthy. Meeting your parents, sharing their holiday, that crosses those lines." Lisa wanted to argue but sensed he wouldn't budge. "Okay," she said finally. "I respect that, but the offer stands if you change your mind." He didn't change his mind, and Lisa went to Ohio alone. When she returned, she brought Washington a container of her mother's sweet potato pie, which he accepted with genuine appreciation. "How was it?" he asked as they shared the pie in his room. "Good," Lisa replied. "Lots of questions about you, though." Washington raised an eyebrow. "What did you tell them?" "The truth," Lisa said simply. "That you're one of the most honest people I know, and that our friendship has changed how I see the world." Washington looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. "Now you're getting sentimental on me." Lisa smiled. "Someone has to." Winter in Atlanta wasn't as harsh as in northern states, but the chill still bit deep, especially in the drafty veterans facility. Washington's room had a heater that clanked and groaned but barely pushed out enough warmth to keep the cold at bay. On the worst nights, he piled all his blankets on the bed and still shivered, remembering the bitter nights on the street corner when staying alive until morning was his only goal. Those memories made his current situation seem luxurious by comparison. He had walls, a door, regular meals. He had his training program, which was going better than expected. And he had Lisa, who still showed up every week with takeout food or a deck of cards or just stories from her life. "David asked me to marry him," she announced one January evening, her cheeks flushed from the cold or perhaps excitement. Washington set down his fork, studying her face. "And what did you say?" "I said I needed to think about it," Lisa replied, avoiding his eyes. "Is that terrible? Shouldn't I just know right away?" Washington leaned back in his chair. "What's holding you back?" Lisa sighed, pushing her food around on the plate. "I don't know. He's great. Really great. I love him. But marriage feels so final. It's supposed to be," Washington said dryly, "though wasn't in my case." "See, that's what scares me," Lisa admitted. "How do you know it will last? How do you know you won't change, or they won't change, or everything won't just fall apart?" Washington was quiet for a long moment. "You don't," he finally said. "That's the gamble. But seems to me the question isn't whether things will change, they will. It's whether you want to face those changes together." Lisa considered this. "When did you get so wise about relationships? I thought yours didn't work out." "Learning from mistakes counts as wisdom," Washington replied with a small smile. "Maybe the most valuable kind." 2 weeks later, Lisa returned with a small diamond ring on her finger. "I said yes," she told Washington, a mix of excitement and nervousness in her voice. Washington nodded, offering a rare, genuine smile. Congratulations. He's a lucky man. We're thinking fall for the wedding, Lisa continued. Nothing fancy. Maybe 50 people at most. Fast track, Washington observed. Lisa shrugged. Once I made up my mind, it seemed silly to wait. Life's short, right? For some shorter than others, Washington agreed, then shook his head at Lisa's concerned expression. That wasn't self-pity, just fact. When you get to my age, you stop pretending you have all the time in the world. The conversation shifted to Washington's own progress. His training program was ending soon, and he'd been doing well enough that his instructor had mentioned a possible position at a friend's garage. Nothing glamorous, Washington cautioned. Oil changes, basic maintenance, starting at the bottom again. But it's a start, Lisa pointed out. A real job. Washington nodded slowly. Been a long time since I had a paycheck with my name on it. February, the possibility had become reality. A small auto shop on the outskirts of town needed help with basic maintenance work. The owner, a gruff man named Frank who'd served in the Gulf War himself, was willing to give Washington a chance. Veteran to veteran, Frank had said during the informal interview. But I'm running a business, not a charity. You mess up, you're out. Washington appreciated the straightforwardness. Wouldn't have it any other way. The job meant Washington could start looking for his own place. The veterans' facility was only meant for transitional housing, and he'd already stayed longer than most. With Lisa's help, he found a tiny studio apartment within walking distance of the auto shop. It's not much, Lisa said apologetically as they toured the bare-bones space. The kitchenette consisted of a mini fridge, a 2-burner stove, and about 2 feet of counter space. The bathroom was so small you could brush your teeth while showering. It's a mansion, Washington replied, running his hand along the wall. My own place. Never thought I'd have that again. Moving day arrived in early March. Washington's possessions fit into 3 boxes and a duffel bag. Lisa and David helped him move in, bringing housewarming gifts, dishes, towels, a coffee maker, and a small TV. Too much, Washington protested when they started unpacking everything. Neighbors are supposed to bring food and supplies when you move in, David said, surprising both Lisa and Washington with his genuine warmth. It's tradition. The 3 of them shared pizza on the floor of Washington's new apartment that evening, using paper towels as plates because the real ones were still wrapped in newspaper. For the first time, Washington seemed to truly relax around David, even sharing a few stories from his army days that had Lisa laughing until tears streamed down her face. You never told me about the camel incident, she accused between giggles. Some stories you save, Washington replied with a wink. As Washington settled into his job and apartment, Lisa threw herself into wedding planning. She'd visit Washington's place after work, spreading brochures and sample cards across his small table. Blue or green for the table runners? She'd ask, holding up swatches. They look the same to me, Washington would invariably reply, which always exasperated Lisa. This is sage and this is dusty blue, she'd explain. Completely different. Despite his color blindness to wedding details, Washington found himself invested in Lisa's happiness. He'd known her for over a year now, watched her grow from a kind-hearted young woman who bought coffee for a homeless veteran into someone who fought for others without losing her own dreams. One evening in April, after Lisa had left with her wedding binders and color samples, Washington sat alone in his apartment, feeling a strange mixture of pride and melancholy. He was proud of how far he'd come, from a street corner to a job and an apartment. Proud of the small role he'd played in Lisa's journey too. But the melancholy was there as well, a familiar companion. As Lisa's wedding approached, he knew their friendship would change. She'd build her life with David, perhaps have children, move to a bigger place. Their weekly meetings would become monthly, then occasional. It was the natural order of things. This train of thought led him to something he'd been avoiding for years. Thoughts of his own family. His ex-wife had remarried decades ago. His daughter would be in her 30s now, possibly with children of her own. Grandchildren he'd never met. Without allowing himself to reconsider, Washington picked up his phone and dialed a number he still knew by heart. His ex-wife's landline. Would she even still have it? Would it be the same number after all these years? It rang 3 times before a man answered. Not her husband. The voice was too young. Is Gloria there? Washington asked, his voice rougher than usual. Hold on, the voice replied. Then muffled. Mom. Phone. Mom. His daughter then. His Karen. Hello? A woman's voice came on the line, familiar despite the years. Gloria, Washington said. It's Thomas. The silence that followed stretched so long he thought she might have hung up. Finally. Thomas Washington. Well, it's been a very long time. 22 years, he confirmed. I'm sorry to call out of the blue like this. Are you in trouble? Gloria asked, her voice carefully neutral. No, Washington assured her. Actually, I'm doing okay. Got a job, an apartment, He hesitated. I'm sober. Have been for 3 years now. Another pause. That's good, Thomas. I'm glad to hear it. I was wondering, Washington pressed, on before his courage failed him, if you could give me Karen's number or give her mine if she wants to talk. Gloria sighed, a sound that carried decades of complicated history. I'll give her your message. That's all I can promise. That's fair, Washington agreed, then gave her his number. After hanging up, he sat staring at the wall for a long time. He hadn't expected immediate forgiveness or a tearful reunion. He'd abandoned his family, chosen the bottle over them, disappeared into his own pain. The fact that Gloria had even spoken to him felt like more than he deserved. Washington didn't tell Lisa about the call. Some things were too raw, too personal to share, even with her. But the act of reaching out had opened something in him, doctor he'd kept locked for decades. That night he dug through his duffel bag until he found an old cigar box at the bottom. Inside were the few mementos he'd managed to keep through years of homelessness, his discharge papers, a few faded photos, and his service medals. He spread them across his small table, each item a connection to the man he'd been before everything fell apart. One photo showed his unit in Desert Storm, arms around each other's shoulders, dusty and tired but proud. He'd been a respected sergeant then, responsible for the lives of his men. They'd trusted him, followed his orders without question. What had happened to them all? Had they built successful lives while he spiraled into addiction and homelessness? Washington picked up his phone again and opened the internet browser Lisa had shown him how to use. His fingers felt clumsy on the small keyboard as he typed, Veterans, Desert Storm reunion groups. The search returned dozens of links, Facebook groups, reunion organizations, VA resources for connecting with former unit members. Washington stared at the screen, overwhelmed by possibilities he hadn't considered before. Hesitantly, he clicked on one link, then another. He didn't have social media accounts, didn't even know how to create one. But there were other ways. Phone, numbers, and email addresses for organizers. By the time exhaustion finally drove him to bed, Washington had written down several contacts. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would reach out. As he drifted off to sleep, Washington reflected on how much had changed in 2 years. From a street corner to an apartment, from isolation to connection, from shame to the first fragile tendrils of hope, and all because a young woman had stopped one morning with an extra coffee and bagel. Summer arrived with sticky heat that reminded Washington of his time in the desert, though Atlanta's humidity made it a different kind of oppressive. His tiny apartment trapped the heat, forcing him to keep his single window open day and night. The small fan Lisa had brought him barely stirred the thick air. Despite the discomfort, Washington felt more alive than he had in years. His job at Frank's garage had expanded beyond oil changes to more complex repairs. His hands, once shaky, had steadied with regular work and purpose. Frank had even started referring to him as the wizard for his ability to diagnose engine problems, just by listening. Like having a human computer, Frank told customers, slapping Washington on the back. Old-school knowledge you can't get from those fancy diagnostic machines. Washington found himself enjoying the work more than he'd expected. Each fixed car gave him a quiet sense of satisfaction, a feeling of usefulness he'd almost forgotten. But even more significant were the connections he was rebuilding. After months of emails and phone calls with veteran reunion groups, he'd made contact with 3 men from his old unit. 2 lived too far away for in-person meetings, but they exchanged long emails filled with memories and updates on their lives. The third, a man named Rodriguez who now lived in Tennessee, drove down to Atlanta one weekend in July. They met at a diner near Washington's apartment, both men nervous as schoolboys. "Sarge?" Rodriguez had said when he first spotted Washington using the old nickname. "Man, I would have walked right past you." Washington knew he'd aged more than the 20-plus years that had passed. Homelessness and addiction had taken their toll. "I'd have recognized you anywhere, Rod," he replied, though it wasn't entirely true. The skinny kid who'd once been under his command was now a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and reading glasses. They spent hours catching up, their conversation awkward at first but flowing more naturally as the afternoon wore on. Rodriguez had built a good life, married with 3 kids, a steady job as an electrician, a house in the suburbs. He showed Washington photos on his phone, including ones of unit reunions Washington hadn't known about. "We looked for you," Rodriguez said quietly. "For years, whenever we got together, someone would ask if anyone had heard from Sarge." Washington stared at his coffee cup, unsure how to respond to the mixture of guilt and gratitude washing over him. "I wasn't in a place to be found," he finally said. Rodriguez nodded, understanding in his eyes. "A lot of us struggled when we came back. Different ways, different degrees. No shame in that." "Some more than others," Washington acknowledged. "True," Rodriguez agreed. "But you're here now. That's what matters." Before leaving, Rodriguez took a photo of them together and asked if he could share it with the others. "They'll be thrilled to know you're okay," he said. Washington hesitated, then nodded. Tell them I'm sorry I disappeared. They'll just be glad you're back," Rodriguez assured him. That evening, after Rodriguez had gone, Washington sat in his apartment looking at the contact card his old comrade had left him. It included details for the next unit reunion, scheduled for November in San Antonio. "Think about it," Rodriguez had urged. "Even if you can only come for a day, would mean a lot to the guys." Washington placed the card carefully on his small table. The idea of facing everyone after all these years terrified him, but a small part of him, a part that was growing stronger by the day, wanted to go, wanted to reconnect with the men who had once been his second family. Meanwhile, Lisa's wedding plans were shifting into high gear. Her visits to Washington's apartment became less frequent as she juggled work and wedding preparations, but she made sure to check in at least every other week, often bringing samples of cake or photos of possible venues. "We finally found a place," she announced during one visit in late July. A garden at a small historic home just outside the city. Not too fancy, but really pretty. Washington nodded approvingly. "Sounds like you. Not too fancy, but really pretty." Lisa laughed, swatting his arm. "Was that an actual compliment, Mr. Washington? Don't let it go to your head," he replied with a small smile. As they sat drinking iced tea in his stuffy apartment, Lisa studied Washington with a thoughtful expression. "You look different lately. Good different." Washington shrugged. "Better. Job, better sleep, better life." "It's more than that," Lisa insisted. "You seem, I don't know, more connected somehow." Washington considered telling her about Rodriguez, about his tentative steps toward reconnecting with his past. But something held him back. These fragile new beginnings felt too personal, too easily jinxed by talking about them. Instead, he changed the subject. "How many people coming to this garden wedding?" "Around 60, Lisa replied, allowing the diversion. "Small by my mother's standards. She wanted me to invite distant cousins I haven't seen since I was 10. 60 doesn't sound small to me," Washington remarked. Lisa looked at him hesitantly. "I was hoping you might be one of them." Washington set down his glass, surprised. "You're inviting me to your wedding?" Of course I am, Lisa said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. You're one of my closest friends. Washington felt a complicated tangle of emotions, touched by the invitation, uncertain about being in a crowd of strangers, worried about standing out. I don't know, Lisa. I don't exactly fit with the country club crowd. It's not a country club crowd, Lisa protested. Just friends and family, people who matter to us. She reached for her bag and pulled out an envelope. You don't have to decide right now, but I'd really like you to be there. Washington accepted the invitation, placing it on his table without opening it. I'll think about it. Lisa smiled, understanding in her eyes. That's all I ask. After she left, Washington opened the envelope and studied the elegant card inside. October 15th. Just 2 months away. The thought of attending made his stomach knot with anxiety, but the thought of disappointing Lisa was even worse. He placed the invitation on his small refrigerator, secured with a magnet Lisa had given him months ago. Every time he reached for milk or juice, he saw it there, a reminder of how far his life had come from that street corner. In early August, Washington received an unexpected phone call. He didn't recognize the number but answered anyway. A habit. From his job where customers sometimes called directly. Is this Thomas Washington? A woman's voice asked. Yes, he replied cautiously. This is Karen. Your daughter. Washington sat down hard on his bed, heart pounding. Karen, he breathed, hardly able to believe it. Mom gave me your number, she continued, her voice carefully controlled. She said you wanted to talk. Yes, Washington managed, his throat tight. Yes, thank you for calling. An awkward silence stretched between them, 22 years of absence impossible to bridge in a moment. I don't know what to say, Karen finally admitted. I've imagined this conversation so many times and now my mind is blank. I understand, Washington said. I don't deserve your time, but I'm grateful for it. Mom said you're sober now. Working. Again. 3 years clean, Washington confirmed. Got a job fixing cars. My own place. It's not much, but it's honest. Karen was quiet for a moment. That's good. I'm glad to hear that. I won't ask for forgiveness, Washington said, the words he'd rehearsed in his mind tumbling out. What I did, leaving you, choosing the bottle over my family, that's unforgivable. But I wanted you to know I'm sorry. So sorry for all of it. He heard what might have been a muffled sob on the other end. I needed to hear that, Karen said, finally. I've spent most of my life wondering what I did wrong, why my own father didn't want me. No, Washington said firmly, his own eyes filling with tears. You did nothing wrong. It was me. All me. You were perfect, Karen. The one good thing I ever did in this world. The conversation that followed was difficult, painful, but necessary. Karen told him about her life. She was married, worked as a nurse, lived in Ohio. She had 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5. Your grandchildren, she said, the words hovering between them like a question. I don't have the right to claim that title, Washington replied honestly. But I'd be honored to know about them if you're willing to share. By the time they hung up, Washington felt emotionally drained but lighter somehow, as if a weight he'd carried for decades had begun to lift. Karen had agreed to call again, maybe even send photos of the children. It was more than he deserved, more than he'd dared to hope for. That night, Washington took out the wedding invitation again. If he could face his daughter after 22 years, surely he could face a crowd of strangers for Lisa's sake. He would go, he decided. He would buy a suit, his first in decades, get a proper haircut, and be there to see his friend start her new life. What Washington didn't do was tell Lisa about the calls with his old unit members or his daughter. Some journeys were too personal to share, even with those closest to you. Besides, he had something else in mind, something that required secrecy. Late that night, he composed a careful email to Rodriguez. asking for help with a special project. The subject line read simply, "A favor for the person who saved my life." October 15th dawned clear and crisp, the kind of perfect fall day that seemed made for new beginnings. Washington woke early, too nervous to sleep past sunrise. He'd laid out his clothes the night before, a charcoal gray suit purchased from a department store with Frank's help. A light blue tie that Lisa had once mentioned brought out his eyes, and shoes polished to a mirror shine the way he'd learned. In the Army decades ago, he showered carefully, trimmed his beard to neat precision, and brushed his short salt and pepper hair. The face in the mirror looked different from the one he'd seen 2 years ago. Healthier, more present, with a spark in the eyes that had long been missing. "You clean up good, old man," he told his reflection, adjusting his tie for the 5th time. The wedding was scheduled for 3 o'clock at a historic home outside the city. David's brother would pick Washington up at 1, giving them plenty of time to reach the venue. Lisa had arranged it all, making sure Washington wouldn't have to worry about transportation. As he waited, Washington found himself pacing his small apartment, alternating between excitement and anxiety. He hadn't been to a social event like this in over 20 years. Would he remember how to make small talk? Would people stare, wondering who this older black man was and why he was at their friend's wedding? The knock on his door came precisely at 1. David's brother Tyler was a younger version of David himself. Same easy smile, same relaxed confidence. "Mr. Washington?" "I'm Tyler. Ready to go see my brother get hitched?" "Ready as I'll ever be," Washington replied, grabbing the small gift bag containing his present for the couple, a set of vintage-style metal measuring cups he'd found at an antique store. Lisa had mentioned once that she loved to bake but never had proper measuring tools. The drive to the venue took them through parts of Atlanta Washington rarely visited, areas of elegant homes and manicured parks. Tyler kept up friendly conversation, seeming genuinely interested in Washington's work at the garage. It eased some of his nervousness, this simple human connection. The historic home was even more beautiful than Lisa had described. A white 2-story colonial surrounded by gardens just beginning to show their fall colors. Cars lined the long driveway, and people in formal wear mingled on the lawn. "The ceremony's in the back garden," Tyler explained, parking behind a line of other vehicles. "Reception's inside and on the terrace after." Washington nodded, suddenly feeling out of place despite his new suit. "Is there assigned seating?" "Nah, bride's side, groom's side, but it's pretty relaxed," Tyler assured him. "Lisa said to tell you to sit wherever you feel comfortable." That was Lisa, always thinking of others even on her big day. The thought steadied Washington as he followed Tyler around the house to the garden, where white chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a simple flower-covered arch. Washington chose a seat in the back row on Lisa's side, partly hidden by a large ornamental shrub. From here, he could observe without being observed, participate without feeling exposed. A string quartet played softly as guests filled the seats, their cheerful conversations creating a pleasant hum in the crisp October air. At precisely 3 o'clock, the quartet shifted to a traditional wedding march. The guests stood and turned to watch as the wedding party made their entrance. First came David, looking both nervous and elated in his blue suit, then his groomsmen, followed by bridesmaids in soft gold dresses that caught the afternoon sunlight, and then came Lisa. Washington felt his breath catch at the sight of her. She wore a simple white dress that floated around her as she walked, her dark hair swept up with tiny flowers woven through it. She looked radiant, her smile wide and genuine, as she met David's eyes across the garden. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt. Lisa and David had written their own vows, promises of partnership and respect that spoke of a deep understanding between them. When they kissed as husband and wife, the garden erupted in applause and cheers. Washington found himself clapping, harder than anyone, unexpectedly moved by the simple beauty of two people promising to face life together. He thought of his own failed marriage, the vows he'd broken, and felt a pang of regret alongside his happiness for Lisa. After the ceremony, guests moved inside for the reception. The old house had been transformed with flowers and soft lighting, creating a warm, intimate atmosphere despite the high ceilings and formal architecture. Washington found his assigned table near the back of the room, sharing it with some of Lisa's co-workers who greeted him politely if somewhat curiously. "How do you know Lisa?" a woman in a floral dress asked. Washington hesitated, unsure how to condense their unlikely friendship into a simple answer. "We met a couple of years ago," he said finally. "She helped me through a rough patch." The woman nodded, seeming to accept this vague explanation. "That sounds like Lisa, always looking out for people." The meal was served, speeches were given, and Washington began to relax slightly, even joining in conversations about cars when he discovered one of the table mates was a classic car enthusiast. He kept checking his watch, though, growing increasingly nervous as the time approached. Rodriguez had promised everything was arranged, but so many things could go wrong. Maybe they hadn't found everyone. Maybe someone had talked, ruining the surprise. Maybe they'd gotten lost or changed their minds. As if reading his thoughts, Washington's phone buzzed with a text message. "We're here. 5 minutes." He excused himself from the table and slipped outside to the front of the house. There, parked discreetly behind some trees, was a large van. Rodriguez stood beside it in his National Guard dress uniform, looking as nervous as Washington felt. "You made it," Washington said, relief evident in his voice. Rodriguez nodded. "Wasn't easy, but when I explained the situation, everyone wanted to help. Some drove all night to get here." The van door slid open, revealing 4 more uniformed soldiers, all former members of Washington's unit, all now serving in the National Guard. They stepped out, adjusting their uniforms and checking each other's appearances with military precision. "Sarge," one of them said, stepping forward to shake Washington's hand. "Good to see you after all these years." "Johnson," Washington replied, recognizing the man despite the decades between them. "Can't believe you're still serving." "Career." "Military," Johnson said with a grin. "Some of us never figured out how to do anything else." Washington introduced them to the wedding planner who had been alerted to their arrival. She ushered them to a side entrance, explaining when and how they would make their appearance. Back inside, the reception was in full swing. Lisa and David had finished their first dance, and other couples now filled the dance floor. Washington returned to his table, heart pounding as he waited. Right on cue, the band finished their song, and the wedding planner took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been informed there are some special guests who would like to say a few words to our bride and groom." Lisa looked confused, turning to David, who shrugged, equally puzzled. The side door opened, and the 5 uniformed National Guard members entered in formation, led by Rodriguez. A hush fell over the room as they marched to the center of the floor, coming to attention before Lisa and David. "Mrs. Lisa Henderson," Rodriguez said formally, using Lisa's new married name. "On behalf of the United States National Guard and former members of the 157th Mobile Maintenance Unit, we're here to honor you today." Lisa's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. She looked around the room, finally spotting Washington, who gave her a small nod. Rodriguez continued, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. 2 years ago, you extended kindness to a former sergeant from our unit, a man who served his country with distinction but fell on hard times after his service. Your simple acts of humanity, a meal, a conversation, your time and respect, didn't just feed his body, they reminded him of his worth as a human being. Washington watched as tears filled Lisa's eyes, her hand reaching for David's. "Sergeant Thomas Washington was more than just our superior officer during Desert Storm," Rodriguez said, his own voice growing emotional. "He was the man who brought every single member of his unit home alive when others weren't so fortunate. He saved our lives in more ways than one." A murmur ran through the wedding guests, eyes turning to Washington with new understanding. "When we learned how you had helped him rebuild his life, we wanted to be here today to thank you personally and to let you know that your kindness created ripples you never imagined. Because of you, many of us have reconnected with a man we respected and missed for over 20 years. Johnson stepped forward, holding a small wooden box. We've established a foundation in your name, the Henderson Foundation for Veteran Reintegration, to help other veterans who struggle after service find their way back to civilian life. The first donation comes from members of our old unit, many of whom couldn't be here today but wanted to contribute. He handed the box to Lisa, who opened it with trembling hands to find a certificate and a small medallion bearing her name. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness save the people who seem beyond saving, Rodriguez concluded. You reminded us, all of that, and we won't forget. Lisa handed the box to David and crossed the floor to Washington, tears streaming down her face. Without a word, she wrapped her arms around him in a fierce hug. You did this? She whispered. They did, Washington replied, his own eyes damp. I just made a phone call. Thank you, she said, pulling back to look at him. But this day was supposed to be about you celebrating with us, not about me. Washington shook his head. I am celebrating. Celebrating the fact that I'm alive to see this day because of you. The reception continued, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. Washington found himself surrounded by people eager to hear his story, to shake his hand, to thank him for his service. The National Guard members integrated seamlessly into the celebration, sharing stories about the young Sergeant Washington had once been. Later, as the evening wound down, Washington stood on the terrace watching Lisa and David dance under strings of twinkling lights. Rodriguez joined him, 2 glasses of sparkling cider in hand. Mission accomplished, Rodriguez said, handing Washington a glass. Beyond expectations, Washington agreed. Thank you. For everything. The foundation is real, you know, Rodriguez told him. We've got funding commitments for the first year already. They want you on the board of directors. Washington raised an eyebrow. Me? I'm hardly a success story. You're exactly what we need, Rodriguez countered. Someone who's been through the worst and found his way back. Someone who understands. As the night ended and guests began to leave, Lisa sought out Washington one last time. David stood beside her, his arm around her waist. Will you be okay getting home? She asked. Tyler can drive you. Already arranged, Washington assured her. You two focus on each other now. Honeymoon starts tomorrow, right? Lisa nodded. Just a short trip to the coast, but when we get back, dinner at our place. I want to hear more about this foundation thing. It's a date, Washington promised. He watched them leave amid a shower of flower petals, 2 young people, beginning their life together. As for him, he was neither young nor at a beginning. But he wasn't at an end either. He was, perhaps for the first time in decades, exactly where he was supposed to be.